for LSD. So what happened? Use climbed. People started to see family members, friends, others going under, lives being destroyed, addiction developing. And then actually that use peaked, and then minority use became a concern, and that became a little bit of propaganda there. But the fact is the bulk of the support for the drug laws was because too many people were using these drugs and getting in trouble with them. Heroin also. James Wilson, a noted criminologist, says, can you imagine if back in the 72, we repealed the heroin law, as was suggested once? We didn't seriously discuss it. He says, we stopped that epidemic, and it had to do with law enforcement and other matters. That's his belief. He studied this matter. He's involved in the heroin issue. So drug laws in the U.S. follow the honeymoon period of drug use, which I said back in the 1900s. Ironically, the biggest murder rate increase was 1907 to 1917. That's before Prohibition. And drugs were made illegal in 1914. A 300% increase in murders. Drugs came about as a cry of the people. Addiction back in the 1900s rivaled that today. 1 million out of 90 million people were addicted to opium and cocaine. Also, what about medical distribution? Maybe we should let the doctors prescribe and give out drugs. When druggists were in control for a period of time, they let the medical people divvy out the drugs. The problem soared. People noticed that neighborhood disorder declined, and they shut down the neighborhood drugstore from selling those drugs. Sweden. We talk about these repressive nations like Singapore. Well, Sweden. They attempted to soften drug laws to get the profit and criminality out of drugs. What happened in the late 70s? A spurt of amphetamine addiction. What they did is they made a broad approach. Law enforcement, but also mandatory treatment and selective drug testing of students. They did a number of things that maybe we would or wouldn't accept. And student use has been cut in half by 1987. Japan. People talk about the Dutch. Who's our major global competitor? Who's the guys making all the mega bucks and buying this country? The people with the lowest drug abuse rate of any industrial nation and the lowest crime rate and some of the stiffest drug laws. They routed two epidemics, one of amphetamines and one of heroin. Both was a combination. Drug law enforcement, strict measures, with drug user stigmatization. They said drug users are bad people, and that seemed to help. And rehabilitation. They also worked on people, educate them. China also, they basically had a country going to war trying to make them keep opium legal. Spain and Italy. Now, Spain's a good example because Spain had some of the strictest drug laws of any country in the world. Then the socialists took over in '83, and they went to having some of the most liberal laws. The result, a spurt in cocaine, heroin, and other drug use and trafficking, and accompanying problems of crime and social disruption. Spain has become one of the major transshipment points for Colombian drug kingpins. And outraged parents, mom and dad, issued a report and embarrassed them into action. And even some of the terrorist groups have blown up discos because of the blatant drug use. It even brought vigilantism because the government wouldn't act to protect the law and order of the people. Italy rescinded some lenient laws regarding heroin use recently. Found the problems too great. Germany and Switzerland. Germany also taking a harder stance. Switzerland's interesting. Now, a lot of people think drug addiction, of course, is down in the ghetto. Switzerland, the richest probably nation in Europe, the highest level of drug abuse and AIDS in all of Europe. And what they did is, in Zurich, for instance, they took a park and they said, okay, we're going to let people use drugs here. The police are not going to hassle them. We're going to take a health approach. And they set up clean needle stands, and they set up condom stands, and they let them sell and buy drugs there. The result? Crime spurted up 30% in that area. And they say it dropped some in other areas, okay? So the crime was concentrated. Maybe that's a good thing. But like I said, they have the highest drug abuse rate, highest AIDS rate. You talk about clean needles working so well. Half of the addicts in Zurich test HIV positive. That's a very high rate. Why? Because one guy said if you don't give the guy another clean needle within 8 minutes, it's not going to stay clean. Mother Jones Magazine, I mean, this is a magazine that kind of has taken and printed some articles for legalization. I'll quote what they had to say. I don't know how to pronounce it too well. But Platts Promenade Park is littered with hundreds of people thrusting needles into their arms and necks. Blood falls to the grass. Bodies overload the park's benches. Heads dangle at an impossible angle. Eyes roll back. This park is a disaster area. And all the health people and all the wagons in the world don't seem to be helping it very much. The Netherlands. A lot of the legalization proponents say, look at the Netherlands with their liberal drug laws. A model for us. That's difficult for me to imagine. First of all, drug laws reflect a more liberal mood over there overall. It has to do with that as much as I think good public policy. I'll give you an example. They had legislation in 1986. It was rejected, but this was proposed, and I couldn't imagine this being even proposed in the U.S., regarding pornography, that the age of consent go from 16 to 12 years of age. Now, could you imagine that discussion taking place in the U.S.? They take a more liberal attitude. But marijuana and other drugs aren't legal in the Netherlands. What they do is the police look the other way. And the Dutch do not raise $1 in tax revenue from the sale of drugs. Why? Because when you legalize drugs, you're going to have a drug lobby, a legitimate drug lobby like the tobacco lobby. And what they have is a junkies union. The junkie union sued in court and said, you can't tax these drugs because you signed the UN Convention against these drugs, and it's therefore illegal for us to have these drugs, and you cannot tax an illegal substance. Now, Iowa just got around that with some of the bill I just saw, the Iowa drug tax stamp. The Dutch also have a police force, a narcotics police force, and they've hardened drug trafficking laws. Now, Ethan said in America, 40% of our federal prisoners are drug law violators. In the Netherlands, 50% are drug law violators. And you know what? Back in the 1900s, when we had the big drug problem just before it turned around with the laws, 50% of the prisoners then were drug law violators. Maybe, tragically, unfortunately, we have to get up to 50%. We're already starting to reduce use now, though, with it at 40%. The Netherlands, according to a report in the New York Times, has become the most crime-prone nation in all of Europe. Now, what do we mean by crime-prone? They say, well, it's really petty thefts. Well, petty thefts, that's not that minor. Because if you're a policeman or a prosecutor, when I was a prosecutor and I first started in court, going to city court, petty theft was about 60, 70% of the court load. It was everything. We had to work out deals with Hill's Department Store and Kmart about how we're going to handle first, second, third offenses so we could plea them out mechanically. But it's the most crime-prone nation in all of Europe. Most of the addicts live on welfare. Unemployment's 15%, and minorities are disproportionately represented among users. Marijuana use, which is sold in cafes, a lot of people say, well, marijuana use dropped. Well, there's some questionable surveys there. A recent one also shows that it's not much lower than in the U.S. And tell me how it's dropped so much if in Amsterdam, drug cafes went from 30 to over 300 in 10 years. What are they selling there? Hot chocolate? Legalizers fail to note, like I said, drug use in the U.S. dropped by 75%. And the Dutch tried licensed legal heroin distribution. They stopped it after a spurt in crime. The Dutch did a report. Now remember, the Dutch are open-minded about this. They studied it, and they said legal heroin will not reduce crime. Now, like I said, the term prohibition is meant to provoke an emotive response. I've listened to tapes of the Drug Policy Foundation. I've listened to them argue for a whole session about what should we call this, harm minimization. Should we call it safe drugs, like safe sex? They debate these things because it's a public relations term. Not that they don't have substance, but they think very carefully about these things. I'm not saying that Mr. Nadelman is involved in that, but I'm saying some of these terms are purposely used to bring out a moral appeal. What was the lesson from Prohibition? Well, see, Prohibition makes us all feel like I'd be a hypocrite. We have enough problems with alcohol. It'd be hypocritical of us to do this to drugs. But see, I'm not here to defend the alcohol policy. I don't believe I have to make my case that the alcohol policy is working to say we shouldn't add another poison that would bring the disaster just as heavily. And first of all, there's some differences between Prohibition and drug laws. The first one is Prohibition attempted to use the law to create a strong moral consensus against the use of a popular drug and beverage that previously enjoyed over 1,000 years of cultural acceptance. Drug legalization is an attempt to use the law to bring about cultural acceptance for use of dangerous drugs that are widely feared and traditionally been rejected. And note I said acceptance. Do we really want people to accept drugs? Well, I don't know. You just told me that Coke's not as addictive as tobacco, and that it's safer than alcohol, doesn't seem to cause the problems, and that most people handle it okay. And gee, under legalization, John Kaplan from Stanford estimates we'd have to charge about 50 cents a dose. $1 lunch money, it could get 2 hits. Also, public opinion. It has a lot to do with it. The alcohol policy has a lot to do with money and public opinion. I talk to kids all the time. And kids that are using and not using all jump up and say, what about alcohol? And they all tell me the number one thing you should do is take that damn advertising off. And I tell them, yes, that's hypocritical. You know why we have it? Because there's a lot of money involved. We wouldn't see any baseball games if it wasn't there. There's no moral justification for it. I don't try to justify it. That doesn't mean I want to add crack and all these other drugs to the pile. Another major difference is that under Prohibition, the use and purchase of alcohol was not illegal. You could use and purchase alcohol without breaking the law. So because Prohibition was such a failure, it argues to me maybe these user accountability laws are not such a bad idea. Medical distribution, doctors could prescribe alcohol, for medicinal purposes. You ever see the little ladies? They could prescribe it. They were the 3rd largest supplier. And what about that terrible bootleg booze that killed so many people? Well, that did go up, but it remained stable throughout Prohibition. And alcohol prohibition wasn't the part of education, prevention, treatment, a broad program, a broad social consensus. Did it fail? From an economic perspective, alcohol was a success. If we look at it rationally as just a cost-benefit basis, it saved money, it saved lives. Oh, there were some gangster killings, but the cirrhosis deaths were cut in half, divorces cut in half, juvenile delinquency cut in half, alcohol psychosis declined. And like I said, the murder rate rose 300% from 1906, 1917, and 30% during Prohibition. And it then did drop quite a bit. But see, murder was like this. And this is before Prohibition, and this is after. So it was on a trend. And there's no evidence that the trend was affected one way or another. Since the repeal of Prohibition, what's happened? $100 billion a year, 300 lives per year, $5 to $6 billion in federal taxes. Does that cover the cost? And alcohol is strongly linked to violent and property crimes. I want to tell you how I could be convinced, possibly, to repeal the drug laws. And that is, everybody working on drug legalization, get the alcohol use of children down to 1.5% where the coke use of children is at. And I'll say, yeah, you can do that. You can have a drug like that legal, and you can make use decline. And what's the real lesson? See, the choice is not, do we have alcohol, or do we have cocaine, or do we have marijuana? It's, do we have alcohol and increased cocaine, plus increased marijuana, plus increased PCP? It multiplies, it compounds the cost. And legalization proponents often fail to comprehend the concept of polydrug abuse. And what that means is that people who use cocaine a lot will drink more, and they'll smoke pot more. And the best way to raise alcohol sales is to make coke legal. They don't switch over one drug for another. He talked about marijuana. Marijuana did not cause crack. Marijuana, it might have changed the supply, but it didn't change the use. Maybe dealers decided to deal in crack, but people didn't decide to use it more. How do I know? Because in 1977, when cocaine use was higher than it had been in a long time, pot use was at an all-time high. Pot use went down. Cocaine use went down. Crack. Cocaine went up. Pot went down. Now, from 85 to now, cocaine down. Pot continuing down. You can't tell me that pot use flies up when cocaine use, or vice versa. You see, people who smoke marijuana 100 times or more are 75% more likely to use cocaine. It's polydrug abuse. You can say, well, people who drink water, cocaine users drink water. Well, that correlation is 10 times higher than the correlation between cigarettes and lung cancer. Yet nobody seems to talk about, well, people drink water, get lung cancer too. The data indicates that cocaine use has declined 50%, like I said, as marijuana fell. Now, what legalization people say is, look, we've got this terrible thing, alcohol, and there's fewer deaths and lower cost from illegal drugs. Yeah, that's because they're illegal. It's drug laws that keep use and associated costs to the economy and human life below that of alcohol. And because drug laws keep use at such low levels relative to alcohol use, the dangers of illicit drugs are grossly underestimated. Drug laws save the nation billions of dollars and thousands of lives every year. But how do you count a dollar saved? Now, legalization advocates contend that even if drug laws do increase use, and in some of Mr. Namel's papers, he said that use would increase, but not that much. But again, tell me, 1,000 years of cultural acceptance, it might not go up that much next year or the year after, but eventually you get this consensus. Remember, this stuff's not as addictive as tobacco. It doesn't cause as many problems as alcohol, and it sure feels a lot better, a lot quicker. We're talking about the limbic system of the brain. We're talking about a pleasure system. It has to do with chemicals. And eventually the stuff reaches cultural acceptance. So they say even if it increases use, the problems by drug laws are greater than the benefits we get. Most of the problems related to drug abuse are actually caused by the laws against use and sale. Most of the problems caused by laws are greater than use. My question is, the problem for whom? Now, for prosecutors, a lot of the problems have to do with the laws. That's what you deal in. For drug users, a lot of the problems have to do with the laws. Let's go through some groups. Let's take the age group conception to birth. At this stage, the problem is solely drug use of the mother. Cocaine-addicted mothers, higher rates of miscarriage, developmental damage to the nervous system, organ defects, clubfoot, kidney and bowel and sex organ defects. Health care, $90,000 per crack baby. Carryover cost to everybody else, drain of health care. The other people don't get it. Any drug policy change that would increase drug availability and decrease price would have a damaging effect. Birth to 1 year old. Guess what the leading cause of death is for kids birth to 1 year old? Homicide. And guess who's doing most of the homicides? Parent neglect or parent abuse. Again, their problem is drug use of parents. Some scientists, and I've got articles, that they believe that cocaine can override the mothering instinct. Because they have mothers that have babies and run out and do crack and leave the baby laying there addicted, crying. In Washington, D.C., infant mortality was up 50% in the first half of '89. 15% of the addicted babies die of sudden death syndrome. Mothers are giving their babies fatal drug overdoses in their bottle, blowing crack smoke in their face to shut them up. Now, what is legal, cheaper drugs going to do with more mothers using? Even more mothers than use. I tell you, the mothers that use are going to use more because they'll use what they can get. For these babies, the drug laws aren't any problem for them. It's drug use. Children from 1 to 12. Leading cause of death? Accidents. Most accidents, drug, alcohol related. Child abuse and neglect, also another major problem. Drug use causes these accidents. A Pennsylvania teenager at a conference we had, he works with the little kids. He goes in the elementary schools, been doing it for years. He said, you legalize drugs, you will destroy everything we work for. Why? Because although some of us can make a distinction that just because it's legal doesn't mean it's good for you, kids see things in much more black and white terms. They're not dumb. They're just maybe a little more honest than the rest of us. And they say if it's legal, that means it's okay. They get that message that it's all right. And kids will tell you that that's the message they will get. Now, to be fair, there are some costs to drug laws for these kids. Some kids are lured into drug marketing. But I'll tell you something, the greatest problem is numerically, on a cost base, is drug use, parent use, accidents. Teenagers, leading cause of death for teenagers. Guess what? It's not drug gang shootings. It's not lung cancer from cigarettes. It's not cirrhosis of the liver from alcohol. It's automobile and other accidents, largely attributed to alcohol, marijuana, and then other drug use. Next comes suicides and homicides. Both these things correspond very heavily with drug use. Now, the murders, the homicides, argue both ways. Some of the homicides are solely use. But some of them are solely use, that affects the mind, arguments, that type of thing. 20% of the homicides I saw, the domestic abuse, fatalities are within the family. They probably have more to do with drug use. And some of them are related to the drug trade, drive-by shootings and such. But I'll tell you something, the number that die from those drive-by shootings pales in comparison to the number that die from accidents. Accidents are always left out of the damn calculus. That's where the deaths are coming from. Adolescent drug use would rise dramatically if drugs are legalized for adults. How do I know? I've got a model. Alcohol is legal for adults. 90% of the kids have experimented with it. 67% are current drinkers. Only 10% have tried Coke. 1.5% use it regularly. Marijuana use is less than half of alcohol use, except in Alaska, where it's legal for adults, or was legal. And drug users are wrong to assume that drug profiteers, this is part of the theory that the drug selling is such a problem. Drug sellers aren't the people that lure kids into drug use. Friends do. Users. When people start first using dope, it's euphoria. Remember, it's the honeymoon. And they proselytize. They can make Jimmy Baker blush. This stuff's wonderful, man. What's the matter with you? Try it. This picture of the drug pusher saying, try this, kid. Come on. That's not where most of this stuff comes from. Now let's say that we're going to still have penalties for sales to kids. They'll say, well, we're not going to legalize it for kids. Well, if the penalties are very severe, if we say, like Buckley, I don't know if people know that, but Buckley says, I'll only legalize drugs when there's an instant death penalty for anybody who sells to a kid. Well, guess what you've done? You've made sales to kid very risky. Means very expensive. Means there's good profits in selling to kids. See, with alcohol, the reason there isn't a big profit in selling to kids, the reason it's a gray market, not a black market, is the penalties are not that high. And the risk of getting caught are not that high. Now, with drug use to kids, that's where we're going to put all our attention. So the risk is going to go up, costs will go up. So we're going to have to make the penalty for drug use to kids about the same as it is for alcohol. Now, does drug use really cause more serious problems than drug laws or drug sale profits? These guys are making money. That bothers some people. These poor guys are making a lot of money. What bothers me is the poison that they're putting out that's killing children. Fatal accidents will kill more teenagers than any other cause of death. And illicit drugs are involved in many cases. Like I said, suicide's on the increase. Also, high-risk sexual behavior. AIDS. A high proportion of kids using crack said they engaged in very risky sexual behavior, not having to do with just prostitution to raise the cost of drugs, from the effect of the drug. It impairs mental judgment. Also, social, health, learning problems. Parents. What's the problem parents have? What is the problem of parents? Is it really associated with the drug laws causing them all this trouble? I'm a parent of 4 children. My greatest fear is that my kid will be tempted and succumb to using drugs and end up with problems on it. I'm afraid there's too many drugs and too many drug users out there. And I'll tell you something, there's some danger in neighborhoods of sending their kids out because of the drive-by shootings. But do you think those people with drug dealers in their neighborhoods want a government crack store down the block any more than they want an illicit crack house? Citizens are fighting back. And like I said, they're demanding police action. They're not saying, police, get out of here, you're violating rights. They're saying, come in here and give us the protection we deserve. What about the children involved? Parents with kids involved in drug. Like I said, there's this idea that drugs don't really do anything. It's just, anybody who's had a kid involved in drug, you go to treatment places, they would tell you they had this normal, nice kid. He got into drugs, he got off drugs, I got my normal, nice kids back. It changes personality. It really does. Alcohol does it too. So what's their fear? That the kid's going to get worse and eventually die. A Wall Street Journal reporter says about his son who died, because of drugs he is dead, and every day my heart breaks a little more. I don't think he would think that the guy who sold his kid dope, that was just a vice crime, kind of a victimless crime, I think he thinks it's a very serious matter, and I think that many more hearts, I think people are tragically killed in drive-by shootings. I think kids die in drug-related murders, but I think more hearts are broken because of drug use. And the non-using public. What about the Joe Schmo in the street? Well, if you go beyond the PR and the media and he has to give you a public answer, his main concern is either a friend or family member, somebody on drugs, if he knows one. It's where it hits home. And then he'll say, maybe drug use on the job. Florida poll just showed a lot of people concerned about drug users next to them. They have to work twice as hard. They have to worry about their safety. Crime is another. But the odds of being killed in an accident are higher than the odds of being murdered. The odds of being injured are higher than the odds of being assaulted. Recovering addicts. I'll tell you something. You talk to AA people, they aren't involved politically anyway. But I've had them come up to me and say, don't let them do this, no way. You talk about that silent majority that Nixon and we all talk about now. You have a silent majority comes to you, and I have a silent majority comes to me. But you won't find recovering addicts, drug-free recovering addicts in numbers supporting this because their problem is drug availability, having the drugs around. And legalization is going to increase. It's going to make it easier. They can't get out of the drug neighborhoods if there's legalization. It'll be down on every corner. Treatment and health professionals. They agree the problem is drug use. I mean, that's the human misery they see. And the shortage of treatment beds and funds is due to an increase in demand for services. Legalization promises more customers, more demand, and they don't want it. What about people of color? Well, some black leaders have called it chemical apartheid, the creation of a bio-underclass. Washington, D.C. Councilman Ray terms it a form of racism. He says it's looking the other way as the poor and their innocent babies die at an early age from state-sponsored addiction. Drug dealers were put out of business by the government crack centers, and I'm going to get into this in a minute, will rob, steal, and burglarize, mostly in the low-income areas. The problem is not just a lot of young hoodlums making a lot of cash. Peter Bell, former director of Black Chemical Abuse Institute, said he can't think of one serious problem in the black community not related to drug use, be it teen pregnancy, education, poverty, you name it. But from a theoretical basis, this problem looks a lot different. Economic terms. It's hard to measure the broken heart of the Wall Street Journal reporter. What's easy to measure is drug dollars spent and supply. And the problem is one of crime associated with black market drugs. Drugs artificially raise prices, bring about criminal organizations. High prices mean addicts have to commit more crimes, more health problems from the impure drugs. Deaths from overdoses, drug-related murder are given disproportionate weight over the major cause of death, which is accident fatalities. The solution is not to take the profit out of drugs for most of these people. It's for the U.S. government to profit in trafficking drugs. Or your state can do it. They're going to compete. The U.S. government is going to compete. We're not going to get rid of drug supply. We're not going to get rid of drug demand. Instead, the U.S. government is going to compete with murderous drug thugs, and they're going to win on a cost-benefit basis. Now, government running things, have you ever seen the government run things? Anybody ever think of the post office? They're going to compete with these guys and win. The price, like I said, cocaine, one guy estimated, would have to go down about 50 cents a pop, or else the black market would pop up. And drug legalization, people want to end the trafficking, right? That's the focus, end trafficking. Now, the drug strategy, the national drug strategy says the main goal is to lower drug use and to get rid of trafficking by taking away the customers. Drug legalization says we will just change the supply from an illegal to an illegal one. There's no more crime in profiting in drugs. It's legal now. And use, well, maybe it'll go up, maybe it won't. I think it just defies common sense to think it's not going to go up, and go up quite a bit over time. There are many schemes, but if, Ethan said we're not just going to open up right away. But the only scheme that's going to work to drive the black market out, if you're really saying the goal is to drive out the black market, especially the violent one causing all the problems, there's only one method. Outright legalization of all drugs, of all potencies, to all users at 24-hour convenient locations with basement bargain prices. Anything else, you're going to have a Talk about push down, pop up, you're going to have a new illicit market pop up. Estimates are cocaine would go to 50 cents. New street drugs have to be immediately marketed. As soon as something pops up on the market, you better quickly get the formula and start producing it. Otherwise, there's a tremendous incentive to invent new drugs. That's where the money's at. Invention. It's interesting, people like Milton Friedman said, crack is only here because of the drug laws. Crack is a convenient marketing form, but drug users don't use drugs because it's convenient for the marketers. You see, before crack, the rich people who had cocaine were making freebase in a very dangerous way on their own. And when hallucinogens like peyote was legal, they went and developed mescaline and LSD under a legal scheme. They're always looking for a higher high. Crack, like I said, though, it was a good marketing tool, but that is not the reason it developed. And the government would have to have this monopoly. They could say, well, private industry could do it. I'll tell you, I'm a lawyer. I've done a teeny bit of business consulting. But I can't imagine a major law firm saying, with legal liability, I advise you to get into this business. Why alcohol? Well, a lot of that's tradition. Tobacco companies are being sued for the harm. But this stuff we know. Intoxication every time and attendant dangers. Risk too high. Insurance companies, you think they're going to insure this stuff? So in some neighborhoods we have as many crack stores and smoking dens as we have bars and everything else. And if you think these guys are going to go to a clinic, they're no more going to go to a clinic to shoot and snort and smoke and pop than a beer drinker is going to go sit in the hospital and have his beer. It's a social thing. Like I said, underage use could be prohibited, but the penalties better not be too severe. Now, if all this was done, I concede the black market would diminish considerably. And would that really take care of the drug problem? The drug-crime nexus, we talked about this. What's the connection of drugs to crime? And here I think I have a little bit of a different twist for you, which I'm anxious to get some feedback on. But anyways, most people rest their assumption that if drugs are legal, you reduce the crime by drug traffickers, street dealers, and drug users. Let's look at the organized street gangs, organized crime. I believe they temporarily lose ground, but they're not going to stop selling without a fight. They're already popping people off in the corner. And those government crack stores better be well fortified and well armed. You might need the U.S. Army in those areas. Government doesn't have a good track record. And even if they win, they compete successfully with murderous drug thugs. These gangsters aren't going to go out and get jobs. The most violent, dangerous people are not going to go out and say, oh, I'm going to go to work now. I can't sell drugs. They're going to shift their emphasis to other crimes. Street gangs in LA existed before the drug problem. Violence is fueled because we got younger people dealing in a very competitive market. The reason the market's so competitive is there's more dealers, more sellers than there are buyers. The nature of the drug itself on human nature is often underrated. You know, we had drug gangs selling drugs all before. And if you say crack's not that violent, that's like what we said about heroin. It's only with crack we've seen this violence just surge. And medical scientists who look at the neurobiology of the brain will tell you there's a very real reason for that. Drug gangs' income expectations have risen. They expect more money. So what will happen when the drug thugs and criminals can no longer make money selling drugs? Think about it. There's all these guys, and if you've been in law enforcement, you know these are not nice people, the majority of them. There's some kids maybe just got in for money, but a lot of people, they are not nice people. They're people, and studies show that crime and drug pushing and all that stuff, it's a chicken-egg thing, which comes before the other. What are they going to do? First, they're going to turn to sell whatever drugs are still illegal to whoever they're illegal for. Intensive marketing to kids. Once that market's saturated, you're going to see an upswing in robberies, burglaries, larceny being committed against non-users. Now, this is interesting. A detective in Washington, D.C., they've had a dip in the burglary and robbery rate. You know what he said? He said, you know why the robbery and burglaries dipped? Because the people that rob liquor stores and burglarize houses are either selling drugs instead of robbing, or they're robbing drug dealers instead of other citizens. Now, is that good? Am I saying, oh, it's great they're shooting each other instead of innocent people? No. But the fact is that robbery arrests have declined. And a lot of the drug selling isn't shooting people. They're selling drugs making money. And since 79, robbery arrests of those under 18, and robbery peaks at 16, 18, has declined 31%. Burglaries 43%. From 84 to 85, robbery and burglary arrests of minors declined 11%. And drug arrests were up 90%. The murder rate's high, much higher than 1980. But remember, what's the chief drug involved with murders, implicated with murders? The legal one, alcohol. We can expect to see more murders involved with the illicit drugs if they're made legal. Drug dealers who are not addicted are selling drugs. Now, this is another thing. They say, we're going to take out the criminal incentive. What's the criminal incentive of selling drugs? Going into business for yourself? The criminal incentive is money. New Nikes, gold bracelets, new car. Are these people not going to want money anymore? You know, it's ironic that 50 to 80% of all felonies involve people on drugs. Now, I'm not saying that there's a public interest in perpetuating the drug trade. If we dry up demand, though, to put dealers out of business, instead of competing and having the government compete, then I believe we'll see a gradual transition and we'll see a reduction in crime. Drug use runs parallel to criminal involvement. Decrease the number of users, and you're going to also decrease potential criminal ranks. Positive peer pressure, part of drug-free education. It's going to get to some of the younger people. Incarcerated drug dealers tend to represent some of the more serious criminals. You know, a lot of people say, all these people are in jail for drug possession. Well, if you're a prosecutor, you know what that means. What was the person charged with? He was charged with drug dealing. You pled it to drug possession, and he was jailed. These are drug dealers primarily in jail. There's some exceptions, and I'm against some of the harsh laws against people just for possession. I really think they're counterproductive, which gets into what we should do, and it's mentioned in the drug strategy, but not enough, and that's alternative sentencing. Boot camps, halfway houses. Halfway houses is a very important concept. People talk about treatment, sending people to institutions. I've listened to drug addicts and people in parole and stuff say the best thing is to get in a halfway house out of the neighborhood of the drug use, where there's work, you go to work, you have therapy, and you're living with others, and you're also urine tested to keep you on the straight and narrow. That's on parole and probation. I don't think there's anything wrong because we know that if they go back to using drugs, the odds of them going back to crime are much greater. That was found out in D.C. And treatment in prison in conjunction with parole. We need more treatment in prison, more when they get out, follow-up. Those are definitely good ideas if we want to cut the ranks, but that is much better than setting up government crack stores. Crimes committed by drug users. Now, drug users commit crimes to get the money for drugs, we're told. And if the drug costs go down, of course, the crime will go down. But so will drug use will climb. That person, I believe, for the user, one user, there'll be an overall decline. They won't have to commit as much crime, but they'll commit a little more back up because they want to use more drugs. 20%, okay? You could cut the price 80%, so let's say the number of crimes down by 20 and up a little for increased use. But you know what brings crime up is the increased number of users. And heavy drug users are not going to go and get jobs. There might be some people who are selling drugs with jobs, but heavy drug users are going to hustle and steal. And guess what? With the government crack store, they're going to steal cash. No more trading in the car they stole for crack. It's a cash-only business, which makes things a little more difficult and dangerous. And users who sold drugs for a living, the user who sells to support his habit, is now going to have to victimize other people. Even if the drugs were given out for free, they still have to eat, pay rent, and one other things. And even the Dutch, in their enlightened policy, concluded again, heroin would not reduce crime. Drugs cause a lot of crime unrelated to illicit drugs. Think about this. Do you think in the neighborhoods where crack sells for as low as $3 a pop, which is very low, there's less crime in the areas than where crack is more expensive? You really think so? In fact, most of the drug shootings are crack-related because of the impact of the drug on the human mind. What about other crime, though? We're forgetting about some crime here. Cocaine is implicated in half the cases of child abuse fatalities, children beaten to death in Philadelphia. 80% of the child abuse and neglect cases, they find cocaine-related, parents using cocaine. You can say that doesn't prove that the cocaine caused it, but that's an awful high correlation out of the general population of 1.53% of the people using the drug. New York City, the drugs involved in 73% of child abuse cases. The number of children, like I said, killed and wounded by stray bullets pales to the 1,200 killed this way. And a lot of these kids are going to have lifelong problems. Now, Mr. Nadelman admits in one article that child abuse would not be improved by drug legalization. Arnold Streback, who heads up the Drug Policy Foundation, the $2 million drug legalization's, advocate group, he says, well, what if we assume the worst and the number of addicts doubled? Even then, legalization would pay off. 375,000 drug-dependent babies, now 750,000, 750,000 drug-dependent babies. Because if the addiction rate, doubles, in fact, it might even go past that because of the people that will be addicted. I don't think that's a good payoff. And drug users are more likely to commit rape, assault, murder, unrelated. Again, a lot of the killings are family-related. And international drug trafficking. What would happen there? I believe that the drug cartels would be greatly aided if we legalize drugs. The number one fear the international drug cartels have is what? American drug laws. That's what's causing a war over there. And if cocaine wasn't legal and inexpensive, the traffickers would fill where there's a void. The drug cartel would also control the legal market. Do you think we drove out the mafia when we got rid of Prohibition? Do you think they're not involved in gambling and even beer distribution and such? Also, the U.S. would become the major transshipment point for Europe and the rest of the world. You look at Spain, you look at the Netherlands, those became the transshipment point. Where the weak laws are, the traffickers, remember, they're not going to have much risk anymore. There's no more AWACS up there. Maybe they don't stop all the drugs, but they consider it a risk. They go to great lengths to avoid these things, perceived risk. So what you see, and Europe now makes up 30% of the coke market. Also, these drug dealers, cartels, have billions of dollars in money, amassed drug profits that they can't get to. They're locked up in foreign accounts. They'd now be able to use these to take over illicit businesses in the U.S. In a message to the people of the U.S., Colombia's President Barco pleaded, don't legalize drugs, reduce demand. I want to go to the moral dilemma quickly, if I can.